welcome to Arts Express. This is Prairie Miller, and on the show, Nero Blinken fiddles while Rome burns. Culture and chaos on the world stage. Pacifica host Garland Nixon is joined by Scott Ritter as somewhat music critics this time around, seeking to make sense of Blinken impersonating both Neil Young and Harry Potter.
Garland Nixon and Scott Ritter. Tony Blinken has made a trip to Kiev and he's singing songs and holding up the fort. Let's talk. You know, Scott, all along for quite a while, there's been a discussion, right? And the discussion has been at some point, this thing collapses, and will the US and NATO, oh, they're going to send troops on the ground, they're going to attack Russia, blah, 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 blah. And I felt, me all along, I said, they exercise the Samsonite option. They do what they've always done. They're going to walk away and leave Europe and everybody else holding the bag with a failed state, and just on they go to their next move. Well, Tony Blinken went to Kiev, brought his guitar. He went to some bar that's filled with Nazi iconography, as if there's a bar in Kiev that isn't filled with Nazi iconography. And he sang a song and he left them. And I don't think things are going so well. I don't think the guys on the battlefield who are running from Fab 1500 bombs feel, like the tide is turning because Nero Blinken is singing songs in Kiev. Your thoughts on that brain dead spectacle?
Well, we know that Tony Blinken has a tendency on occasion to pull out his guitar and relive his college-y fantasy life of being a rock and roll star. I couldn't tell if he was getting the licks in properly or not. Look, I played air guitar. I've entered a couple of air guitar contests in my day, and I can fake it to make it if necessary. But it looked like he might have been playing something there. I applaud him for his courage. I mean, I avoid karaoke for a reason, and because it would be a disaster for me and the venue. But he got up there, he plugged in, he played. But this is a man who's never shied away from making a fool of himself. He is a Secretary of State who regularly embarrasses himself and the nation with his pronouncements about policy and policy linked to his assertions of American moral supremacy, that the rules-based international order is actually something that the world should applaud, not condemn. And on this trip, trying to breathe life into a dead body. I was a firefighter, and for a while, and I drove an ambulance, and I took paramedics and EMTs to a number of calls where there's somebody not having a good moment. And I've watched, and I've actually participated in CPR, some successful, most not. But I know what it's like to try and resurrect the dead. I sort of felt bad for Tony because he was trying to resurrect the dead. The murder of Ukraine is taking place, and it is murder, but it's murder that's self-inflicted. It's not. I'm not going to put that label on the Russians. The Russians are simply completing a job that shouldn't have been started to begin with, but it was started only because of the Ukrainian side. The Russians are, in the process of achieving what you and I have been talking about for some time. I mean, military math makes what's happening and what's about to happen inevitable. There's no getting away from it. The Ukrainians are in a state of collapse. They have no more manpower. And you can tell by the reinforcements they're sending into the Kharkov direction, which, by the way, should have been a heavily fortified line. Tens of millions of dollars were allocated to creating these well-prepared defenses to shield Kharkov from any Russian push out of the north. It turns out that all those dragon's teeth that the Ukrainians used to mock, look at the Russians putting in their dragon's teeth. The Ukrainians built them themselves, but they were just piled up. They never were installed. The trenches were never dug. The fortifications were never hardened. Troops were never, earmarked for the task. And the Russians have come in and they are slicing through what passes for Ukrainian defense like a hot knife through butter. The Ukrainians have stripped away their so-called fire brigades from the Donetsk and Zaporizhia fronts, Kherson even, the Kraken brigade, this right-wing fanatic special forces unit that specializes in murdering civilians and hanging out behind the battle lines to shoot any Ukrainian soldiers who dare retreat. That's their job. They've been put into the front. They're getting slaughtered. The 3rd Assault Brigade, which is the Azov Battalion Regiment Brigade, renamed so that nobody understands who they really are, except they always shout out who they are anyways. They've been pulled out of Chasiv Yar direction after refusing to fight because they recognized they would die there. They're now being sent to die in Kharkov. We'll see how long they choose to stay in the battle. Some of these specialist Ukrainian intelligence units that aren't meant for conventional warfare, because they're the last units left, are being thrown into this battle and they're being slaughtered as well. There's nothing left. The Ukrainians have gone back and they're stripping whatever they can from the primary line of contact to send up to Kharkov. That's not enough. Not only are the Russians coming down through, toward Kharkov, the Russians continue to press their advantage along the entire line of contact, making advances. The Ukrainians can't stop them. We are looking at collapse. And I would say that if the Russians do what many people expect them to do, further extend the advance out of the north towards Sumy, where the Ukrainians have no forces, it's game, set, match, because at this point in time, the Ukrainians, in order to meet that, will have to stretch everything so thin that the structure will just fall in on itself. This is the destruction of Army Group Center, the Operation Bagration that took place back in, July, August of 1944. We're seeing that play out in its modern variation today on the, fields of battle to the north of Kiev and along the Donbass and Zaporizhia fronts. Blinken can't change this. I mean, he can't come in and just go, as much as he wants to look like an elderly Harry Potter, oh gosh, I'm having a roll this morning. There is no magic wand he can wave to suddenly make Ukrainian military formation show up. There's no magic wand he can wave to make equipment appear on the battlefield, because the Russians are interdicting it the second it crosses the border. As all this billions of dollars of equipment start making their way to the front, it's being blown up in the warehouses so that by the time it gets to the front, there's not much of it left and there's no one to give it to because all the soldiers are dead. What did he talk about, though? $2 billion more. Again, it's election year.
That was supposed to be $65 billion.
Well, that was
63.
This is additional. This is an additional $2 billion. An additional $2 billion. You see, now that we've gotten through the roadblock of funding, we can now start just throwing money at Ukraine. And this is here I am. Okay, I'm a Ukrainian. I'm like, Blinken's coming in. All right, America's going to step up. They're going to do something leadership-wise because America's this great leader. They're going to help us because they promised to always stand by our side, never walk away from us. They'll be there till the end. Well, it is the end, guys. We need stuff right now. What are you going to do? Here's our shopping list. Top on the list. We need two, not one, two Patriot batteries. We need them right now because the Russians are slaughtering us. And Blinken comes in and goes, well, might get you one, maybe sometime. But what I want to talk to you about is a $2 billion joint defense production plan that I have, where we're going to come in and we're going to help you reinvigorate your defense industry. And we're going to begin joint production of stuff that maybe once the factories are renovated and remodeled and built 2 years from now, you might be able to produce something. The Ukrainians are going, dude, there ain't going to be a Ukraine in 2 years. It ain't going to be Ukraine in 2 months. This thing is done. That was what Blinken had to offer. Words, empty promises. And then he got up there and he crooned, keep on rocking in the free world. if you're going to betray everything you claim to stand for, if you're going to get up there and, walk away from the obligations that, you personally and your nation have made to the Ukrainians, in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom, I couldn't think of a more hypocritical song to sing. So it was perfect. It was actually, when I first saw it, I was like, this is horrible. The more I reflect on it, this was the perfect night. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, looking like an elderly Harry Potter, trying to play a guitar, singing a song, Keep on Rocking in the Freeing World, that was performed by a Canadian, that was mocking America, not celebrating America.
Yes, it was.
And he's singing it in a bar that's noted for its allegiance to Ukrainian nationalist ideology. It was perfect. It was literally the perfect night. Tony Blinken deserves the Presidential Medal of Freedom for this, because the Presidential Medal of Freedom now has an Orwellian connotation. It's not a Medal of Freedom, it's the Medal of Betrayal. And that's exactly what America is doing to Ukraine right now, betraying them. And I have to be honest, it was predictable, and I'm sort of happy they're doing it, because this betrayal will lead to an even more rapid collapse of Ukraine that can bring an end to this conflict, and people will stop dying. Because right now, what's happening to the Ukrainians, they're suffering horrific casualties all along the entire line of contact. You've got, the new Baghdad Bob, Sarah Carter, I guess, whoever the new Ukrainian sergeant is, out there. I mean, it's comedic. Chasiv Yar stands, Slav Ukraina, and then runs off to NATO to get, stroked by the NATO people, and then comes back, Kharkov stands, Slav Ukraina. And I'm like, are you literally looking at a map when you say this, or do you just, spew? They pull. You're programmed with one phrase, and they pull your string, and you just repeat that phrase over and over and over again. But that, again, just like Tony Blinken is the perfect symbol of the collapse of everything America's supposed to stand for, Sarah Ashton Carter is the perfect example of what Ukraine is, and because it's nothing.
Yeah, it's not what it claims to be. How about we go with that? It ain't exactly it claims to be.
And they have difficulty with their pronouns, because when I see Ukraine, I don't see freedom and democracy. I see Nazi banderas to Azov, but that's okay. I mean, pronoun confusion seems to be rampant in Ukraine today.
Yeah, well, and as I see it, there's a number of elements here, but you can focus on the military. Obviously, what's happening militarily is catastrophic to be charitable for the Ukraine project. But I've always felt like this. At some point in the background, the oligarchs who, for those people who don't know, one of the reasons that they don't have, Scott alluded to it, one of the reasons that they don't have some of these structures and trenches and things in some of the areas that were supposed to be guarded and were supposed to be fortified was that tens of, if not hundreds of millions of dollars went to the area, and they were pilfered by oligarchs with fake corporations. So again, this is what Ukraine does. Money goes in. It's like a Roach Motel, right? Money goes in, but it don't come out. But here's my point. At some point, Scott, all this crap is going on the front lines. The Russians are running over the Tony Blinken singing God only knows what song. And at some point, the oligarchs, the politicians, at some point, the people in the background say it's over. You know what I mean? At some point, they look at it and they start thinking, how do I get out of this thing alive? Some of the oligarchs, I better get the hell out of this country. Some of the politicians, I better start flipping and talking to the Russians because they're going to be in charge soon. You know what I mean? At some point, the foundation that makes Ukraine politically, economically, et cetera, viable, those people wake up and say, this game's over. And when they do that, they just pull a rug out from it. I mean, that's what I see happening. When I say collapse, sure, the military's collapsing, but you know what I mean? If you're in the background and you're pushing this thing and you look and you're like, the walls are coming tumbling down, and the Russians will come here and start arresting people, locking them up, grabbing us, holding us accountable for all kind of unthinkable things. Investigations could start. People are going to start thinking about how they survive. And in a corrupt country, there is no dedication to the country. The individuals are going to look inward and say, how do I make it? Screw the rest of this project.
And coming up next on Arts Express,
even now I can feel it, buried somewhere deep inside, watching me, waiting. But you know what scares me the most? When I can't fight it anymore, when it takes over, when I totally lose control. I like it.
and that was Eric Bana, our guest on the show, as Hulk back then. And a decade later, Bana has moved on to portraying a quieter sort of sleuth, investigating corporate crimes playing out deep in his native Australian wilderness in Force of Nature. Bana will likewise talk about how Richard Pryor first inspired him creatively early on when a stand-up comic in a Melbourne bar, and his upcoming role in Berlin Nobody. First, some scenes from Force of Nature, then Eric Bana.
Aaron?
Alice?
Thank God, can you hear me?
Are you okay?
Daniel knows.
Alice?
Alice has been on her own for more than 30 hours. Why did she call you? A couple of feds out of their natural habitat?
Daniel Bailey. You work with Alice?
She's a very highly regarded member of our team.
No mobile phones. You need a social media-free weekend, ladies.
You'll survive.
Your mind starts to play tricks on you out there. Like you're being watched.
Was Alice up to something?
I think people make their own choices. Although we're not always clear of the consequences. Are we, Alice?
None of you have been honest with me about what happened out there.
Why are you really here?
Out there, nature holds us all to account.
Hello and welcome to our show.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Now, you're the producer of Force of Nature as well as the star and the second time around. So what about this film and this story touched you personally as well as dramatically that led you to embrace the production?
Yeah, it was a very unique opportunity to reprise a character which I've never done before. And when we made the first film, we weren't really thinking about the second installment. We were just trying to make the best film we could. And then the success of The Dry enabled us to contemplate adapting this. And we applied the same rigor as we did the first one. We loved the setting. We thought the premise was really strong and different, with something that we hadn't really seen before. 5 women on a team-building corporate retreat who get lost in the bush. Just sounded really interesting, and we knew cinematically it could be really interesting. And I love the journey of Aaron Falk as our lead investigator. You know, it's one of his informants who's lost in amongst these 5 women, and it ramps up the danger. So there's many factors that made us really exciting to adapt it.
And what can you say about the subject of corporate financial crimes driving the psychological intrigue behind this story?
Well, I think it makes Aaron a bit obsessive. I think these kind of companies that are doing white collar crime. It's he's in financial services part of the federal investigations, and so this is his bugbear, and I guess it's different to traditional crime, but no less damaging for a lot of people, and he's quite obsessive about it, and there's something that's happened in his past which we learn during the course of this film that elevates his sense of, I guess, responsibility and guilt towards using an informant on the inside who seems completely innocent.
Now, you started out as a stand-up comedian in a Melbourne bar, and you've said that it was Richard Pryor who influenced you to become an actor. How so?
He was my influence to become a stand-up. Yeah, so I grew up watching Richard Pryor, and he was just a hero of mine. I loved his style of stand-up and his kind of character-driven storytelling. Both him and Barry Humphries were my two heroes comedically, and I just thought he was the greatest. I still do. I think his stand-up is just incredible.
And how would you compare and contrast up against all these women in this film, as opposed to, say, contending with men in The Hulk and your different approach?
Oh, God, I can barely remember that. But we were really excited because what Jane Harper did an amazing job of with this book, with the 5 women at the centre of the story, was she writes them so well. You never, ever have to go back a page to remember which character it is that you're trying to connect with and identify. And there were 5 completely different women from the same company, and which we thought was a really, really great central part of the story. And then came the fun part of actually casting those roles and watching them emerge on screen and getting the balance of all their characters right was a lot of fun. And they're just an incredible bunch of actors. And Deborah Lee's a very, very old friend of mine, and both myself and Rob, the director. So we were thrilled when she came on board as Jill. She was the first person we cast out of the 5 women. And then we kind of cast, from there on, and it all kind of fell into place.
And what are your thoughts about the choice and significance of the title for this film, Force of Nature, and how nature itself is a kind of character in its own right, driving the narrative?
It's really important, and it's what Jane Harper does incredibly well. The locations and the landscape are always an integral part of her story and like a central character. And it also says something about, to us, I think, spiritually, as Australians, I think we grow up understanding that Mother Nature, holds us to account all the time. It tries to beat us around 3 or 4 times a year and bring us back down to earth. We fundamentally grow up knowing that we're second fiddle to Mother Nature and its powers. And I think that's central to the Australian psyche and character. So I love the title, Force of Nature, of the book, and we wanted to use it again with the film.
And how is the approach different for you portraying a character in an American film as opposed to an Australian film?
Well, I mean, it makes me realise just how incredibly lucky all these British and American actors are that never have to do an accent. I've always found it very weird that there are so many Australians in the world, but they're never, ever, 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 ever allowed to appear in world cinema. You never see Australian people on screen.
Yeah.
It's just such a weird thing. So yes, to get acting in Australian films and speaking our native tongue, it's a breath of fresh air for us.
And what are the different challenges for you of playing a real person in a film such as Henry Tudor in The Other Boleyn Girl, as opposed to playing a fictional character?
It's a really interesting balance because on the one hand, there's a sense of responsibility and pressure that can come with it. But then I think the real key is coming to the point where you have the confidence to let go of that and try and own the character for yourself and do your own interpretation or version of it. Because I think the audience can smell it if you don't feel it, if you don't feel like you've taken ownership of the character. If you're just trying to serve the experts or the historians or the reader of the original material, you'll fail miserably. So you always have to just come to a point where you own your interpretation of whichever character it is, and try and approach it with confidence. I think that's the key.
And in your distinguished career, what are some of the memories and things that have meant the most to you?
Oh, look, I pinch myself every time I get to walk on a film set. I always see them as little miracles, especially when you're working on original material that's not part of a massive thing, you know. So most of my career has been spent working on this size film, you know, just, I guess, adult drama. And so I really enjoy them. I love them as a film goer myself. These are the kind of films I like to watch. So they're the films I like to be in. And they're all different. They're all really different experiences and really special.
And what can you say about what you're up to in the upcoming cult drama, Berlin Nobody?
Yeah, so that was amazing. And I think we might be releasing that sometime this year. So I'm really excited. It was a wonderful film to make over there in Germany, in Berlin, city I love and love to work in. And the last time I was there was when we made Hannah, of all films, which was a wonderful experience. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing that with everybody.
And is there anything you can say about what you're up to in Berlin Nobody?
In that particular film, yeah, I play an expert on cults, basically, a social psychologist, and he's working overseas. He's divorced, and his daughter is based in America, played by Sadie Sink, and she comes to spend a semester with me in Berlin, and some interesting things happen while she's staying with me.
And I wanted to ask you, when Eric Bana looks in the mirror, what does he see?
Oh, dear. Depends on how much sleep I've had. You know, here's a tip. Don't look in the mirror. Just get out of the shower and keep walking.
Well, what's the difference of looking in the mirror and looking and the camera looking at you? A different view.
Yeah, you just don't need to do it. Less mirrors, the better, I say.
And do you watch your own movies?
Oh, well, obviously, you know, with on the producing side, you know, there's no escaping that editing process and so forth. So I try to divorce myself from the two. I try and be very rigid and strict when it comes to assessing films and plots and storylines and performances. So the first time I can kind of divorce myself from my performance. The second time's always harder.
And any last word to share with our listeners about Force of Nature?
Yeah, I just really hope people get a chance to take a look at it. It's a very unique Australian film. If you figure you'll never get a chance to travel to Australia, we can save you the trouble. Both our films, the first one, The Dry, and this one, Force of Nature, depict two very, very different parts of Australia that you wouldn't necessarily associate with Australia when you first think of it. So yeah, it's a pretty unique depiction of our country.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric Bana, for calling into our show.
Thank you very much. It's great to talk to you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
This is Jim Messina, and I wanted to let you know that I'm going to give a shout out here for Arts Express.
There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
And now on Arts Express,
Welcome to I Fought the Law. The law being corporate media and its shilling for global arms dealers and fossil fuel companies as it cheers on global war and planetary destruction. I'm your host, Dennis Bro. I'm a journalist, novelist, educator, and media critic. Well, our guest today on I Fought the Law is Juan, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Michigan, public intellectual, and an informed commentator on an area in truth that the West, though deeply entangled in, knows little about, and that is the Muslim world of the Middle East, now possibly rephrased as West Asia. Juan, welcome to I Fought the Law.
Thank you, Dennis.
The term forever wars was coined to describe the U.S. post-9/11 war on terror, a war seemingly without end against a foe that could be everywhere and nowhere. The term has now been used to describe the endless wars the U.S. seems to be engaged in as it helps escalate the conflicts in the Middle East, arms Taiwan in a possible military confrontation with China, and continues its proxy war against Russia in the Ukraine. What is prompting this increased conflict against, in all three cases, Russia, China, and Iran, nuclear-armed opponents?
I think it's just the character of post-World War II American empire. The United States is still the sole superpower as it emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. And corporations want to be able to extract benefits and engage in trade throughout the world, and the U.S. government is the guarantor of their ability to do so. So much of the U.S. intervention in the rest of the world is driven by economics, and it's not something that is ever admitted from the podium of the State Department or the White House spokesman. But, as a historian, I've been in the archives, and it was incredible to me when I looked into U.S. policy towards the Arab Gulf states in the 1960s. It was all correspondence between the U.S. consul and the oil companies. In some ways, in that era, the U.S. just forwarded the Gulf policy to Chevron and the other big American oil companies of the time. That kind of U.S. intervention and conflict precedes the war on terror and will succeed it as well. The U.S. was involved in dozens of interventions in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, before all this began with the war on terror stuff, but overthrowing the government of Honduras and things that most Americans don't even know that we were involved in. And, in the case of Central America, United Fruit was really important to those interventions. So what changed, I think, with 9/11 was that the non-state forces in the rest of the world despaired of their states being ever strong enough to take on the United States, where they saw the U.S. as oppressive or overly extractive of local resources. And the world has changed so much technologically that for the first time, a non-state actor could hit the U.S. mainland in a significant way. And you think about World War II, and the U.S. mainland, despite some fears of Japanese balloons and things off of the coast of Oregon, the U.S. mainland wasn't involved in World War II in a violent way. Thomas Mann, the German expatriate writer who had fled Hitler, was in California and writes about how all through the war it was incredible to him that the Californians were just having barbecues and mowing their lawns and not involved, really. Whereas, of course, as a European, he was living the battles daily, his mind as he could get the news. So the 9/11 was a sign that the U.S. empire as an enterprise in ensuring that states were complicit and complacent towards U.S. Corporate power that time had passed, and that and now the U.S. had to be worried about non-state actors, and that's a different level of engagement. And the U.S. routinely bombs Somalia. There's no congressional declaration of war on Somalia. It's not clear what the status of the president's actions in Somalia are, but it's bombing al-Shabaab and other non-state actors, often on behalf of a Somali government that the U.S. prefers and recognizes. In some instances, actually, they're, as far as I can tell, pretty good guys who got elected as president of Somalia, but they're under attack from al-Shabaab, and the Horn of Africa is important to international shipping. It may not be a big resource center in and of itself, but the U.S. empire can't afford for the Horn of Africa to be hostile to international shipping, and we saw recently how a non-state actor in the form of the Houthis in Yemen can just empty out the Red Sea from the big container ships with small weaponry. I mean, drones and undersea drones and so forth. So that's my explanation for the character of the U.S. on the war on terror, the character of the more intensified U.S. Imperial interventions around the world, which are now no longer, you do a coup and you get the government under your thumb, which was possible in earlier eras. But now it seems necessary to the U.S. security establishment, what Ben Rhodes, the former national security advisor, calls the blob in Washington. It seems to them that now you need a new level of granularity in U.S. intervention.
Yes. Just as you were saying about, it's hardly ever that we hear them talk about, in State Department dispatches, but we hardly ever hear them talk about oil in the Middle East, what was so strange or striking and why they don't like Trump is when he said, we're in Syria, we got the oil, we're holding the oil, and we're keeping the oil. It was like, what are you doing? You're giving away the game, Anyway, okay. Can you talk a bit about the arms industry in the U.S., in some sense, perhaps the last major industrialized part of the economy left in the country, and how both the government, the major political parties, and the media support that industry? On the one hand, we have the Democrat Biden shipping billions to Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with that money often never leaving the country, just finding its way into the pockets of the weapons industry, while the Republican Trump demands that the European countries fork over more of their money to NATO, which is again largely a demand for a continent in huge economic disarray to contribute to the U.S. arms industry for its so-called protection, or what might be thought of really as a protection racket.
Well, I'm a Middle East expert, and so I only know a little bit about the character of the U.S. arms industry. My understanding is, as a historian, that the end of the Cold War in the early 90s was a crisis for the arms industry. The U.S. Pentagon budget is just enormous, and over $800 billion a year. It's as much as the next 14 countries after the United States. And what isn't generally understood is that a good half of that money goes right out of the Pentagon to subcontractors, to civilian subcontractors. My parents settled in the Washington, D.C. area, and I had a summer internship one time where it was bringing coffee to people and working in the office and so forth with this private firm. And some proportion of the firm was doing that. And I heard this one retired colonel on the phone, and he was just calling up his former buddies in the Pentagon that he had used to work with not so long ago, and pitching them weaponry to buy for the Pentagon, using his insider knowledge of what they might need and who they were. in order to arrange a contract. And so
revolving door.
Of the over 800 billion, 400 billion goes right out into the civilian economy, and it's going to arms manufacturers and service industries that service the Pentagon. And so the end of the Cold War was a crisis because it was entirely possible that the U.S. military budget would go into steep decline. And of course, it is crazy that it's so large. It's just incredibly larger than it needs to be for any obvious purpose. And it's a kind of corporate welfare is what it is. Mm. So what would you do in that situation? Well, one solution that the arms industry in the 90s had was to go from making things and selling things to the Pentagon to selling them internationally. Now, from the 90s forward, the U.S. would become a major arms dealer for the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And that didn't make up for all of the shortfall, but at least it was something that they could do. And by the way, other countries saw this model and emulated it. So Russia, for instance, it's been argued that the Russian intervention in Syria was in part an advertisement for a new generation of Russian fighter planes and tanks and so forth. That, there's an international arms exposition in Dubai every year, at which all of these big arms sellers come, and France, Russia, the United States, to some extent now, China. They're all there, and it's one of the ways they make their money is keeping. And it's been proven. We don't know very much about why wars start as social scientists, but I had a colleague, David Singer, who did a big project on the origins of war, and the only statistical correlation he could find for the outbreak of wars was that a country had recently bought a lot of nice new shiny weaponry, and then it went to war. Mm. So you can imagine how that would happen, because if you buy a lot of nice new shiny weaponry, if you don't use it, then your rivals will also get up to speed, and it becomes antiquated. And so you have an advantage if you bought the latest generation, and a lot of it, the only logical thing to do is use it. So the arms industry, not only that of the United States, although the U.S. is a big part of it, is probably fomenting these wars. And it's a treadmill, because then once the wars begin, you need more weaponry and more bombs. And so this industry, I think, plays a role in behind the scenes in fomenting these wars. I've been told by Washington insiders that some of these think tanks in Washington, D.C., who were, promoting the Iraq War and these other boondoggles, the think tanks were getting money behind the scenes from the arms manufacturers. And of course, then they give money to congressional campaigns. They're in the districts of congressmen who need to be reelected and need to bring home the bacon. And in their case, especially in the West Coast, a lot of the districts depend on the arms industry. So I think then 9/11 solved the problem for them. This is not only could they export weaponry to other countries as a way of making up the Cold War shortfall, but they could invent a new Cold War. And this was a perfect Cold War in the sense that the Soviet Union was an unreliable rival because it collapsed. But if your new Cold War is against non-state actors everywhere in the world, then, as you say, it's a forever war, and you never run out of a pretext for these huge Pentagon budgets and for all of the money that goes into the arms industry. So it is itself kind of a forever machine inside U.S. politics.
Yes. I think it was Dean Acheson who said, Korea came along and saved us. in 1950. Well, I guess you're saying sort of 9/11 came along and saved the arms industry also. Okay. Well, your area is the Middle East. What do you see as the gains for the U.S. in escalating its unequivocal backing of Israeli genocide and its spreading the war to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon? Is it oil rights? Is it thwarting China's Belt and Road project with its plans to link this area of the world with the rest of Asia, as opposed to the U.S. alternative of an Israeli-led pipeline to Europe? Why this spreading death and destruction as opposed to, as you pointed out, China's bringing of Saudi Arabia and Iran together and the halting of the devastating war in Yemen?
Well, as you suggest, I think petroleum is behind a lot of it. You know, a fair proportion of the world's petroleum comes out of the Persian Gulf, and there's natural gas as well. The U.S. doesn't need those things, so my view is that the Washington establishment sees Israel as a big aircraft carrier in the region. Yep. Behind the scenes, it does a lot of work for the United States and its petroleum corporations and other corporations. And so the work that would be difficult for the U.S. to do itself, and which no other U.S. partner in the region is willing to do. Mm-hmm. So it's a bridgehead in this region that, you know, without the Middle Eastern petroleum and to some extent natural gas, the U.S. allies would see their economies collapse. Leftist and radical movements might well take advantage of that. Nowadays, you can't rule out far-right movements taking advantage of it. But in any case, this kind of the corporate capitalist world order that the U.S. benefits so much from would face threats.
Right. So it's time now to play Global Jeopardy. For the last segment, we'll play Global Jeopardy. Since the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, partly because of the possibility of a nuclear conflict because of 3 possible nuclear wars, has now moved the doomsday clock ahead to 90 seconds to midnight or planetary destruction. And we're now all in Global Jeopardy. It's up to you to pick one category among the ones I will read. We'll look at the answer, and together we'll try to form a correct question around this answer, since the media often formulates the wrong question. And since in philosophy, it's often said the job is to ask the right question. So the categories for today are How I Learned to Love the Bomb, Blinken and You'll Miss It, Bricks versus Mortar, Arms and the Mensch, and Middle East, West Asia. So it's up to you to pick a category.
Well, obviously, I should choose Middle East, West Asia.
Okay, so the answer is the old imperial name of this region sees it as an isolated region, whereas the contemporary name sees it as part of the global South. So what is the implications? What are the implications of calling this region West Asia?
Well, the Middle East as a term developed in the 19th century. It possibly came out of the India office in Britain, but it was popularized by Alfred Mahan, the U.S. naval theorist. It was picked up in the British press in the early part of the 20th century. Valentine Chirol wrote a book, The Middle Eastern Question, 1902. Before that, it tended to be called the Near East, and wasn't clear where the Near East began and Central Asia ended. So the French tended to call to put Iran in Central Asia, for instance, and how the Europeans and the Americans viewed this region changed over time. But I think the emergence of the Middle East really had a lot to do with the solidification of British rule of India. So India and China were the East, and the Middle East was what you had to go through to get to them if you were the British Navy. Mm-hmm. And especially from the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. So I think that helps to explain why we went from Near East to Middle East. West Asia is the way that the place is referred to, as you say, in the global South often, in India, for instance, they reject the term Middle East and they insist on West Asia. Of course, they're South Asia. And so a geographical way of talking about people is less Orientalist and doesn't position them with regard to the West, right? Why are they the East? It's because of Europe considering itself to be in the West.
Yes.
But Europe is actually part of Eurasia. And there isn't any obvious demarcation line that would cut Europe off from Asia. And so if we look at the world that way, the Europeans are Eurasians and the people in the Middle East are West Asians. One of the drawbacks of West Asia as a term, however, is that Egyptians and Syrians have had a lot to do with one another, and they're in the Arab League, and they're Muslims in the main. And so what do you do about North Africa? So now there's, some departments are called Southwest Asia and North Africa. We have this acronym of SWANA being proposed. And I think it just makes for a mouthful. And that's one of the reasons the journalists, at least, have stuck with the Middle East. But as I said, if you watch Indian TV, they always say West Asia.
Asia, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so it is a kind of, so one answer to the question is it is a kind of throwing off of the imperial yoke to adopt this term and to stop using the more imperial term. So great. Well, thank you. Our guest today on I Fought the Law is Juan. Thanks for appearing. Thanks for playing Global Jeopardy. You did very well, which means you get to come back and play Global Jeopardy again as the world moves closer to playing Final Jeopardy. And that's it for this edition of I Fought the Law. See you next time. And in the meantime, keep fighting.
And that's all we have time for today on Arts Express, Expression in the Arts. And if you'd like to express yourself too, you can write to us at theradiogoddess@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Prairie Miller leaving the station.